Adele's journey into the haunted mansion started innocently enough. When she first moved into the grand estate, she was enchanted by the sprawling grounds, the aged stonework, and the timeless beauty of the home. But soon, whispers of a dark past began to seep into the air, creeping through the walls and floors like an unseen presence. The mansion, built in the 1700s, had seen its fair share of tragedy and loss over the years. The whispers of restless spirits weren't new to the locals, but Adele had never believed in such things until she moved into the house herself. It began with small, almost imperceptible noises, a faint creak in the hallway late at night, the sound of footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. Adele, thinking nothing of it at first, attributed it to the age of the house or maybe the wind. But as time passed, the occurrences grew more unsettling. It was one chilly evening, just as Adele was preparing to retire for the night, that she heard the distinct sound of footsteps pacing outside her bedroom door. At first, she thought it was her staff, perhaps someone checking in on her. But as she opened the door, no one was there. Adele shrugged it off, convinced it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the footsteps continued, night after night, growing louder and more deliberate. They never came from the direction of the stairs or the main hallway. Instead, they seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, moving across the old wooden floors with a heavy, purposeful tread. One night, she decided to follow the sound, tiptoeing down the darkened hallways, heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps led her to a door she had never noticed before, a small, almost hidden door in the farthest corner of the mansion. Curiosity got the best of her, and with trembling hands, she turned the handle. The room inside was cold and abandoned, a forgotten space that hadn't seen light in decades. But the strange sensation of being watched filled the air. It was then that she realized this wasn't just an old house. There were things here that didn't belong. The footsteps weren't the only unsettling occurrences. Soon, Adele began hearing soft whispers, voices, distant but distinct, coming from the very walls of the mansion. They seemed to be speaking in a language she couldn't quite understand. Sometimes, they would echo in the dead of night, and other times, they would be faint, like whispers carried on a breeze. Adele would often wake in the middle of the night to the sound of voices calling her name. Sometimes they were gentle, almost soothing, but other times, the tone was desperate, filled with panic and sorrow. "Adele, you're not alone," one voice would say. "Don't leave us," another would whisper. Though she tried to ignore the voices, they grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the house itself was trying to communicate with her, desperate, almost pleading. The more she listened, the more she realized that the mansion held a history of its own, a history that the spirits within wanted her to uncover. As Adele dug deeper into the history of the mansion, she learned that it had been the site of several tragic events over the centuries. The previous owners had lost loved ones in unexplained circumstances. Some believed the house to be cursed, while others claimed it was the work of vengeful spirits trapped by the mansion's walls. One local legend spoke of a tragic love story from the 18th century, where a young woman had died under mysterious circumstances. It was said that she still roamed the halls of the mansion, searching for her lost love, her cries echoing through the night. Adele couldn't help but wonder, was this the voice she had heard? One fateful night, as a storm raged outside, Adele decided to confront the spirits that had haunted her home for so long. She stood in the heart of the mansion, calling out to them, demanding answers. For a moment, there was silence and eerie, suffocating stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Then, the footsteps began again, but this time, they were no longer distant. They were right behind her. Adele turned, her heart racing, but there was no one there. And yet, she could feel the presence of something or someone standing just inches from her. A cold breath whispered against her neck, and the voices grew louder, more frantic. "Get out! Leave this place," they pleaded. Adele fled the mansion that night, never to return. She left behind her possessions, her music, everything, but she couldn't escape the feeling that the spirits of the mansion still followed her. To this day, Adele Mansion remains abandoned, a place shrouded in mystery and darkness. The stories of footsteps, whispers, and ghostly encounters continue to haunt the halls, keeping visitors and new owners away. Whether it's the restless spirits of the past or something even darker, the mansion's secrets remain buried, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. After leaving the mansion, Adele tried to move on. But the whispers, the footsteps, and the oppressive feeling of being watched never truly left her. No matter where she went, it was as if the mansion's haunting presence had followed her, lurking just behind every corner. It was as though something deep within that house had attached itself to her, a dark force that refused to let her go. Adele tried to live a normal life, but the anxiety would return in waves. She found it harder and harder to sleep, waking up at odd hours, staring into the shadows of her room. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would hear those same footsteps, though now they seemed to come from the floors of her new house. The whispers followed her, too soft at first, but always growing louder. The words were now clearer. "You cannot escape." One night, unable to shake the feeling that something was calling her back, Adele made the decision to return to the mansion. It had been months since she left, and the reports of the house being abandoned had only intensified. Locals spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, and some claimed to have seen figures moving through the halls, though no one had dared venture inside in years. Adele entered the mansion once again, this time with a sense of purpose. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the threshold, the door creaking shut behind her. The air felt thick, like the house itself was alive, holding its breath. As she made her way through the familiar darkened hallways, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The temperature dropped, and her breath became visible in the cold air. The house seemed to have a life of its own now, its wooden floors creaking underfoot as though the mansion was slowly waking up. Adele found herself drawn to the same hidden door she had discovered that first night, the one she had dared not open before. This time, her hand trembled less, and a strange calm washed over her as she slowly turned the handle. The room inside was even darker than before, but something about it felt different. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. But it wasn't the room that terrified her, it was the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for her. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, almost imperceptible, like the flicker of a flame just before it goes out. The shadow whispered her name. Adele. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't her own. It wasn't anyone she had ever heard before. But the voice seemed to pull her closer, luring her deeper into the room, as though the very air around her was alive, beckoning her forward. At the far end of the room, Adele noticed a large, ornate mirror. It stood against the wall, covered in dust, as though forgotten by time. There was something about it, a strange energy radiating from it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows in the room began to shift. Adele couldn't resist. She stepped closer to the mirror, wiping away the dust with the back of her hand. The glass was cold to the touch, and as she peered into it, something about her reflection seemed wrong. It was as if the person staring back at her wasn't her at all. The figure in the mirror smiled at her, but it wasn't a smile she recognized. The eyes were cold, hollow, and dark like the void itself. Her heart raced, and she stepped back, only to find that her reflection remained, staring at her with a malevolent grin. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, the walls warping and closing in around her. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Adele could feel a weight pressing against her chest. She stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen. The footsteps, which had followed her for so long, grew louder, closer, rushing toward her with terrifying speed. And then, the voices started again, but this time, they weren't whispers. They were screams, loud, desperate, shrill, as if 1,000 souls were calling out to her from the depths of the house. "Help us! You must help us!" the voices cried. Adele was paralyzed, caught between the mirror and the doorway, unable to move. Something was closing in on her, something dark and ancient, and it was hungry. The shadow that had been lingering in the corner of the room finally took form, a figure, tall and cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, eerie light as it reached out toward her, its cold hand brushing against her face. "Leave now," the figure whispered, "or you'll become one of us." Terrified, Adele broke free from the trance-like grip of the figure. She bolted for the door, the footsteps echoing behind her, growing louder with every frantic step. The mansion seemed to shake, the walls groaning as though the entire structure was coming to life, trying to trap her within its grasp. She ran through the halls, her breath ragged, until she finally reached the front door. With one final burst of energy, she threw open the door and stepped into the night, the cold air filling her lungs. But even as she fled, she could still hear the footsteps following her, the whispers clinging to her mind. She looked back at the mansion, its windows glowing with an eerie light, its doors still open as though waiting for her return. Adele never returned to the mansion after that night. But the strange occurrences continued to haunt her. The footsteps, the whispers, they followed her everywhere. She began to lose sleep, her once bright spirit darkening as she found herself drawn back to the mansion, even if just in her dreams. And the mirror still called to her. In the quietest moments, when she was alone in her home, she would catch glimpses of her own reflection of that dark, hollow figure watching her from the depths of the glass. Was it the mansion that haunted her? Or had something far more sinister followed her out that night, taking root deep within her? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. But still, Adele could not escape the grip of the mansion. The nightmares began to feel more like memories than dreams, vivid images of the mirror, the shadowy figure, and the whispering voices that called to her in the dead of night. No matter where she went, no matter how far she traveled, the house loomed in her mind, a specter that could not be outrun. At night, she would often wake up to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door. But it wasn't just any footsteps, it was the heavy, deliberate pacing she had heard in the mansion. She tried to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but deep down, she knew it was real. One particularly restless night, after an eerie vision of the mansion played in her sleep, Adele woke to a sensation she had not felt in a long time, an overwhelming pull to return to the mansion. It was as if the house itself had sent a call, and she was helpless to resist. Her heart raced, and her thoughts became clouded with an insatiable need to find answers. But there was one object she could not forget: the mirror. The cold, empty reflection that smiled back at her with hollow eyes. It had been the center of her terror, and yet, there was something about it that fascinated her. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed to beckon her. Unable to ignore the pull any longer, Adele packed her things and made her way back to West Sussex, the mansion standing in the distance like a darkened monument to her fear. The closer she got, the more the air around her seemed to grow heavy, thick with a presence that pressed against her chest. Upon arriving at the mansion, Adele hesitated. The once grandiose building now looked like a decaying ruin, its windows shattered and the ivy creeping over the stone like a slow, suffocating hand. Yet, as her feet crossed the threshold, the familiar chill enveloped her. The whispers in the air were louder now, clearer, as though they were waiting for her return. They called her name again, but this time, there was something different in their tone, something darker, more urgent. She ventured deeper into the mansion, the air growing colder with every step. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the silence between the whispers felt like it stretched for eternity. It was as if the house was alive, feeding off her fear, drawing her closer to its core. Adele made her way to the hidden room, the room with the mirror. As she stood before it once again, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The reflection was no longer just her own. There, in the glass, was the figure she had seen before, its eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. But now it was smiling wider. It was beckoning her. Unable to resist, Adele reached out to touch the glass. The cold surface sent a shock through her fingers, but she couldn't pull away. The room around her seemed to blur, the walls bending and twisting as if reality itself was unraveling. The air became thick with a suffocating force, and the whispers grew to a deafening crescendo. "Adele, Come to us. The voice was no longer distant but directly in her ear, its breath cold against her skin. The reflection in the mirror began to shift. The figure in the glass was no longer just an eerie shadow, it had substance, its features becoming more defined, more real. It reached out, its hands pressed against the glass as if trying to break through. Adele could feel its cold fingers brushing against her own. A chilling voice echoed through the room, "You don't belong here. But you can never leave." The mirror began to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen hand. The reflection was no longer her own, but a dark, twisted version of herself, a pale, hollow-eyed creature that grinned back at her with malicious intent. She could feel it, whatever this thing was. It wanted to take her, to become her. It was pulling her in. As the figure in the mirror reached toward her, something in Adele snapped. Panic gripped her chest, and her breath came in sharp gasps. The whispers turned into shrieks, a cacophony of voices that seemed to fill the entire mansion. The room began to distort, the walls warping and stretching, and Adele could feel the ground beneath her feet begin to crumble. The mansion was alive and it was hungry. "No!" she screamed, pulling away from the mirror, but the grip on her was too strong. The shadows surged forward, pulling her toward the glass, and she stumbled backward, tripping over the rotting floorboards. In that moment, she saw it, the truth of the mansion's curse. There had been others, many others before her, who had succumbed to the house's grip. Their faces, their twisted forms, stared back at her from within the glass. They were trapped there, their souls lost forever, their bodies hollowed out by whatever dark force had taken hold of the mansion. And now it was her turn. Adele fought with everything she had, but the house was too powerful. She could feel the cold, clammy hands of the spirits tugging at her, dragging her closer to the mirror. Her limbs grew heavy, as though the very air around her was pressing down on her body, making it harder to breathe. But as she looked into the mirror one final time, something strange happened. Her reflection, the twisted, hollow version of herself, stopped moving. The creature in the glass stared back at her, its eyes wide with an expression of fear. It seemed to recognize something in Adele, something the house had not anticipated. Before Adele could react, the room was filled with a brilliant, blinding light. The figure in the mirror screamed in agony, its face contorting in pain, and for the briefest moment, Adele saw something else, something much darker lurking behind the glass. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything went silent. Adele woke on the cold, hard floor of the mansion, gasping for air. The light was gone, and the house was still eerily still. The mirror, however, had vanished. There was no sign of it, no reflection in the room, just the darkness pressing in on all sides. She had escaped, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion still watched her, still reached out to her from the shadows. She had been spared for now, but the house had a memory, and its hunger had not been sated. Adele left the mansion again, this time for good. But even as she drove away, she could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling her name. Years passed, but Adele could never shake the dark pull of the mansion. Though she left it behind, her life became a shadow of what it once was. The whispers continued to haunt her, creeping into her thoughts even in the brightest of days. Every reflection she passed, every darkened corner, carried a haunting reminder of the mansion's curse. One fateful evening, as Adele stood before a mirror in her home, she felt it, the same cold shiver that had gripped her that night in the mansion. The reflection that stared back at her was no longer just her own. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw the shadowy figure from the mansion, standing behind her, its hands pressing against the glass from the other side. It smiled, that same malevolent grin, its eyes dark as the void. Before Adele could move, the mirror shattered. But it wasn't just the glass, it was the thin veil between worlds. The mansion, still alive, had claimed her at last. The next morning, the house was gone, vanished into the fog that had always surrounded it, as though it had never existed at all. But for those who knew the tale, there were whispers of a new reflection, haunting the place where Adele once stood. A reflection that was not quite her own, but something darker, something waiting to claim the next soul. The mansion's curse would live on, waiting for its next victim. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.